Hi there, I am Veronique Florec from the University of Western Australia. Welcome to this course on the economics of natural hazards. I have created this video series for anyone in the natural hazards and emergency management sectors that is interested in learning how we apply economic analysis to the management of natural hazards. This project is funded by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. Welcome to the fourth video in the series. In this video, we'll have a quick look at the relevant scale to use for an economic analysis, and after watching this video, you will know how to choose the size of the case study area for your analysis and in which cases you should consider a larger area. You will also get a good idea of what to include and what not to include in an economic analysis and how far down the chain of events we look to estimate indirect impacts. I will also explain a little bit the difference between analyses that are done at the macro scale versus those that are done at the micro scale, so that you understand the purpose of each type of analysis. First, what scale should we choose when we're doing an economic analysis of mitigation options for natural hazards? Should we look at the local scale, at the regional scale, or at the state level, or even go at the national level? This is very important because the scale that we choose for the analysis will determine to a large extent the cost and the benefits of mitigation, because we're basically deciding what we include and what we don't include in the analysis when we're setting the boundary. We're basically deciding how far we're going with this. Therefore, the scale we choose will influence the decisions we make about mitigation and how we prioritize the allocation of resources. So it is very important that we spend some time talking about it. As I've said in previous videos, a lot of the decisions we make about how to conduct an economic analysis will depend on the question we want to answer. It is very important that we know why we're doing an economic analysis. What is it that we want the analysis to help us with in order to be able to design the analysis properly? So the scale of the analysis and the methods we use will depend on the questions we have. For instance, if we are a planning department and we are considering putting in place land use restrictions to prevent developments and community infrastructure in areas prone to hazards, then the scale of the analysis would be the relevant area to the restrictions. This could be a local government area if the restrictions apply to an area managed by a single council, or a region if the restrictions apply to an area managed by several councils, or it could be another scale. It could be at the state level if the restrictions apply to the whole state. If we were an electricity distribution company, that wants to know how to prioritize vegetation clearing along network lines, we might need to look at the whole network managed by the company. So the scale of the analysis will be identical to the size of the network. This could be the size of a city or half a state. If we are a government department responsible for prescribed burning and we want to know the impacts of increasing or decreasing the amount of prescribed burning currently done in a region, the scale of the analysis will be the region of interest. If we're a local council and we want to know the impacts of building a dam in a river, we might want to look at the local government area scale or at the catchment scale. If the catchment is bigger than the local government area, it might be worth also consulting with the other local government areas. Both analyses will give us different bits of information, so it's important that we know what it is that we need from the economic analysis to decide on the scale. And what might look like not a very good investment at the local level might actually be a beneficial action at the catchment level. So it's important that we know these things. If we're a minister trying to decide whether to put more funds towards prescribed burning or to buy more trucks for firefighting, we could be looking at the state level or at the national level, depending on which minister is making the decision. And if the government is deciding which industries need more help after being impacted by natural hazards, we could also be looking at the local, regional, state or national level depending on what level of government is making the decision. If we want to know how the regional, state, or national economy has been impacted by a series of natural hazards, then we will look at each of those levels independently: regional, state, or national. And what do we include and what do we not include in the analysis? We usually use the physical boundaries selected, local government area, regional, state, or another boundary, to decide what to include in the economic analysis. For direct impacts, it is relatively easy to decide which to include. We simply include those within the physical boundary of the analysis. If the direct impacts of the hazard we are analyzing always extend further, so outside of the physical boundary of our analysis, then it might be worth considering doing a second analysis with an extended boundary and compare the results. With indirect impacts, it's a bit different. By their nature, indirect impacts are harder to measure than direct impacts. More often than not, the availability of data or the capability to model indirect impacts is what will determine which impacts we include. Indirect impacts have not been measured, studied, or modeled to the same extent as direct impacts, so they are much more difficult to identify and measure. And they generally spread over much wider areas than the area where the natural hazard occurred. For example, if a natural hazard caused damage to power lines, a broken power line can be easily seen and we can easily estimate the cost of its repair. Much less obvious are the losses caused to industries that were forced to close down because they have no power supply, or the losses to companies that still get power but that lost business because their suppliers or buyers were closed due to a power outage. There are also the losses to companies that lost business because employees of the firms affected by the power outage had reduced incomes and consequently they spent less. So how far do we go down the chain of events? Ideally, we will include all the indirect events triggered by the natural hazard. And notice that even that might be difficult to identify because we will need to isolate those impacts and be sure that they were ultimately triggered by the natural hazard event and not by other factors or economic forces. In reality, what we include in an economic analysis will often be limited by the amount of information we manage to get about those flow-on effects, which in many cases is not very much. Now, what about impacts on the economy? Could natural hazards affect the GDP of our country or some sectors of the economy more than others? The answer is yes. Natural hazards can affect the GDP of our country and impact some sectors of the economy more than others. But if we want to estimate those impacts, we will use different methods to the ones that I am explaining in this course. And here we need to have a word on terminology. In economics, we make the difference between an economic and a financial analysis. Usually the term economic is used to refer to the wider economy, in which case we talk about the impacts of natural hazards on the gross domestic product of the country, and we look at the impacts of the hazard on different sectors of the economy. So the evaluation is done at what we call the macro scale, usually the state or the nation. And we look at the real opportunity cost of a given loss. What will we have today if we didn't experience that loss? A financial analysis considers the loss to the individual household. So the evaluation is done at what we call the micro scale. And we look at the cost of replacing the assets damaged. In this course, we're looking at the cost of replacing the assets damaged, which is more in line with a financial analysis. But it all gets quite confusing here, because the term financial analysis is also used to refer to the assessment of the viability, stability, and profitability of a company or a project. And we probably heard it used in that context a lot more. So I will say that to avoid confusion, in this course I'm going to use the term economic analysis, which we are already familiar with, but I will use it to refer to the assessment done at the micro scale, which look at the impacts of a hazard on the affected area and the cost of replacing what was damaged. So we know now the tricky terminology, but to keep things simple, I'll call what I'm explaining here economic analysis, even if I'm not dealing with impacts on sectors of the economy or the economy as a whole. Now I'm going to summarize what I've presented in this video. 1. The size of the analysis depends on the questions you want to answer and what type of decision you want to evaluate. You will generally ask yourself, over what area will my mitigation program be implemented, or what is the size of the jurisdiction that I am managing? You will also look at the size of the largest hazard that can occur in your area, and if it is larger than the boundaries you have selected, or if your mitigation option could prevent hazards outside the area that you're looking at. 2. For direct impacts, it is easy to determine which ones to include. Basically, we include those things damaged by the hazard within the case study area. For indirect impacts, it is less obvious. But because it is a lot harder to obtain information for indirect impacts, you will usually be limited by the data available. And 3, when we look at the impacts of natural hazards on regional or national gross domestic product, or the impacts on different sectors of the economy, we're looking at the macro scale, which requires different methods to those that I am explaining in this video series. When we look at the impacts of natural hazards on individual households and the cost of replacing the assets damaged, we are looking at the micro scale, which is the type of scale we are studying in these videos. Okay, that is it for this video. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we will discuss money transfers into the area affected by a hazard.